The following stories in this week's Act Out are brought to you by activist journalists. To help us keep bringing you this news, visit patreon.com/actout and become a patron. This week on Act Out, 6 months ago, people engaged in protests and blockades at Donald Trump's inauguration. Old news for some, but perpetual nightmare for others. This coming week, solidarity actions are planned to bring attention to unlawful arrests, harassment, and even sexual assault at the hands of the injustice system. Next up, disabled activists rarely make the front page, but their fight for our healthcare is a continuation of decades of work and something that we all need to take note of and lend our voices and bodies to. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. July 20th marks 6 months since the J20 protests in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day. You may recall our reporting from the J20 protests, but details about that day continue to roll in even now, particularly as some activists are still facing up to 7.5 decades in jail for partaking in the protests. Little side note here, the average prison sentence for a rapist is 8 or 9 years, which means that someone who held a "fuck Trump" sign could spend almost 10 times longer in jail than someone who fucking rapes a person. Just let that sink in for a second. Now, while that's marinating on the back burner of your mind, let's bring these points to the fore. Seized and hacked phones, raids on the houses of organizers, personal information leaked online, and the most recent development, where arrestees, including members of the media, recounted sexual assault by Metropolitan DC police, including a forced cavity search during which other officers laughed. Now, the ACLU has filed a lawsuit against MPD accusing them of, quote, making wrongful arrests, violating protesters' constitutional right to free speech, denying detainees from accessing food and water, and carrying out invasive body searches. The suit goes on to say that MPD used, quote, overwhelming and unlawful force, and again, if you recall from our reporting, police used concussion grenades, tear gas, and physical force against protesters, and at several points kettled and arrested peaceful protesters, including members of the press. No dispersal warnings were announced, nor was any care given to assess why or what people were being arrested. Interestingly enough, in late February, the D.C. Office of Police Complaints issued a report on police conduct on J20, where it outlined MPD's failure to use SOP, or standard operating procedures, in dealing with First Amendment assemblies. For example, not only did MPD fail to issue warnings to disperse, which is SOP, but they also then refused to let people leave, again kettling protesters so as to force them into being arrested. Furthermore, the SOP handbook, which was supposedly given to all officers before J20, is very clear in its directives on the use of OC spray, aka pepper spray. Firstly, it specifically prohibits use of OC spray to disperse a crowd or on a person whom the officer does not have legal cause to take into custody. It also states that officers must issue a warning before using the spray. However, based on OPC Monitor's observations, it appeared that these prohibitions were not followed, as OC spray was deployed to move the crowd without warnings, and in many instances it was used on people who were simply standing in the wrong place. Furthermore, and very oddly enough, while the SOP gives clear guidelines on the use of pepper spray, the use of other less than lethal weapons is essentially on a free-for-all basis. They are merely listed as a, quote, tool for a commander to use to deal with unlawful activity. I never. You mean giving someone with a hard-on for militant and jingoist authority riot gear and concussion grenades and saying, have fun, might end badly for whoever didn't come dressed as a fucking transformer? The report goes on to make this shocking deduction. It is evident that this lack of direction in the SOP led to widespread use of the weapons on Inauguration Day, and they appeared to be deployed as a means of crowd control, and not necessarily in response to an unlawful action. Yeah, that was evident. And while the Office of Police Complaints report includes recommendations that suggest appointing an independent consultant who can thoroughly review MPD's actions via body cam footage, aerial videos, plus media and civilian footage, no such independent consultant has been appointed. In fact, the MPD has been unwilling to even let go of information that they are legally obligated to release. In March, the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund filed a suit against the district under the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, stating that MPD improperly and illegally withheld information regarding MPD's conduct on J20 at the very moment when its release would inform the public and the DC Council in their evaluation of Peter Newsham's nomination to be Chief of Police. Now current DC Police Chief Newsham ignored not only a FOIA request, but the DC First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act, which gives strict guidelines on both record-keeping and public disclosure. This should, in reality, not come as much of a shock based on how he handled the J20 protests themselves, or indeed how he handled the 2002 World Bank protests, where MPD rounded up hundreds of people without warning, held many for more than 24 hours, some of whom were hog-tied. I can totally see why Mayor Bowser thought that Newsham was the right man for the job. Police brutality is so in right now. As is, of course, the crackdown on protesting, the right to free speech and assembly. You may recall from episode 112 that there is a long list of legislation aimed at cracking down on our rights to stand up against their cracking down on our rights. And many people are already and still battling the injustice system after exercising those rights. Standing Rock is a prime example. People also facing decades in jail for having the gall to demand clean water over corporate profits. As Dylan Petrohilos, whose home was raided and burgled by MPD, said in an interview with Al Jazeera, now more than ever, we need people to show solidarity with J20 arrestees, but not just them. People facing similar charges in Sacramento, Standing Rock, and so on. To not show up for one or the other is a failure to all. It is in this paradigm of solidarity that Defend J20 Resistance released their Points of Unity statement, which outlines defendants' solidarity with each other and refusal to accept any plea deals that cooperate with prosecutors at the expense of other co-defendants. Building upon that foundation of unity, starting July 20th, organizers are calling for an international week of solidarity with the J20 defendants, leading up to a motion to dismiss all charges on July 27th. Organizers are asking people to donate and/or fundraise, make phone calls to urge investigations into police conduct, perform outreach in order to build solidarity with J20 arrestees, but also to use this opportunity to build networks and indeed courage for continued work. As stated in the release, use the Week of Solidarity as a means of connecting struggles. The J20 defendants aren't the only ones facing felony charges for their resistance or presence at political events. Organize joint events to benefit other defendants as well. Think of ways to connect across movements using such events as a stepping stone toward building robust and combative movements that can withstand repression and take the initiative. It is imperative that people not turn away out of fear of repression or isolate themselves. That is what the state wants. We must meet these charges with defiance and continued resistance. We must respond not just as supporters, but also as active comrades in a shared struggle. To read the full release, complete with links to more backstory and ways to plug in during the Week of Solidarity, visit the bit link J20 Solidarity Week below. Moving on, they're loud, they're fierce, and they'd rather risk death than see their and your healthcare get cut. You've probably seen stories about protesters torn from their wheelchairs as they shut down senators' offices, resisting the devastating new Republican healthcare plan that would push even more people into ill health, bankruptcy, and death. To give you a rough idea of how many, there are currently about 29 million people uninsured under the ACA, although many who are insured still suffer from the economic burdens of trying to stay alive. That number may drop a bit by 2026, but under the proposed AHCA, revised or not, more than 50 million people would be uninsured. And we'll get to what third option would leave no one insured, but first, let's circle back to those protests. Organized under the hashtag #AdaptAndResist, these protests have spread across the U.S., from Capitol Hill to legislators' offices around the country. We've all been justifiably horrified to see people defending their right to health care literally dragged to jail and sometimes bloodied in the process. But as with anyone who places their body squarely in the path of the powers that be, these protesters don't want our pity. They want our solidarity. Because this is a struggle that we should all take part in. They also aren't new to this struggle either. Actually, disability rights advocates from groups like ADAPT are some of the fiercest and most effective activists around. And they've transformed the world that you live in to everyone's benefit. In today's New Old News segment, we're going to look back at the history of the struggle for accessibility and equal rights for the disabled, and why we should all get involved with their fight, our fight, right now. The fact that disabled people are able to move with relative freedom through most modern cities and easily access education, housing, and shopping is thanks to decades of direct action and tireless political lobbying. And whether you know it or not, you or someone that you love lives a better life because of that. Most historians pinpoint the beginning of the disability rights movement in the 60s, and to Edward Roberts, a pioneering disabled student at the University of California at Berkeley, who, while in school, used an iron lung at the campus hospital during the night, and during the day had a respirator attached to his wheelchair. While earning a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, Mr. Roberts helped fellow students to organize into a self-help group, whose services included free counseling, off-campus housing referrals, and an expert wheelchair repair crew. He also taught political science at the university for 6 years. In the 70s, he founded the Center for Independent Living, a vital resource that helps disabled people live fuller lives, travel more freely around their communities, and lobbies for better laws. And yet, despite the efforts of people such as Roberts, by the 1980s, most disabled people were still trapped in nursing homes or lived with family and barely left their houses. There simply weren't enough services, housing, or accessible facilities and transportation. They just didn't have any other options. That's where groups like ADAPT, which originally stood for Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, came into play. The first city to cave to the pressure and promise all accessible bus fleets was Denver, a promise that came only after a dramatic series of public transit shutdowns, when other forms of negotiations proved fruitless. Here is an account from the Denver Post. In the early morning of Wednesday, July 5th, 1978, protesters waited for an RTD bus. It rolled to a stop at Broadway and Colfax Avenue, one of the busiest intersections in the state. Within seconds, it was swarmed as people in wheelchairs blocked both front and back. The group, then called Atlantist, had been talking to RTD for more than a year, trying to get wheelchair lifts added to all buses. A new fleet had just been released, but none was accessible. People were angry. Another bus pulled behind the first. Protesters surrounded it, too, locking both in place. Traffic stalled for miles. Police of increasing rank would come, demanding that the group disperse, but the protesters, known as the Gang of 19, didn't budge for 2 days. Not until RTD agreed to add lifts. It was the first public transit agency in the nation to do so. In other words, the buses in your city likely have wheelchair lifts because ADAPT was willing to shut down traffic until cities realized that it was easier to accommodate them than deal with their constant protests. Insert parallel to any progressive battle won against a stagnant system here. In another famous example, ADAPT and their friends successfully pressured Congress to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. The bill had become stalled at the House Committee on Public Works and Transportation. So on March 12, 1990, dozens of ADAPT protesters out of hundreds present at a rally left their wheelchairs behind and began literally crawling up the steps of the Capitol. And here's how the blog History by Zim describes the famous Capitol crawl. Over 60 activists abandoned their wheelchairs and mobility devices and began crawling the 83 stone steps up to the U.S. Capitol building, during which people were loudly chanting, "What do we want? ADA. When do we want it? Now." "I want my civil rights," Paulette Patterson of Chicago said as she was inching her way to the top. "I want to be treated like a human being." 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan was famously taped while crawling up the stairs. "I'll take all night if I have to," she firmly stated. When it finally passed later that session, the ADA would revolutionize the lives of disabled people, allowing them to force almost any business or institution to make reasonable accommodations for their access, whether that's the corner burger joint, a university, or a hospital. Even prisons and police have to respect the bodily autonomy of the disabled and allow them access to mobility devices or interpreters for the deaf, thanks to laws like the ADA. And that's another reason why the sight of activists being dragged out of their wheelchairs is so fucked up. It not only puts their lives at risk, but it's also actually fucking illegal. Despite numerous tangible victories like bus lifts and the ADA, ADAPT has kept protesting, demanding better health care, expansions to Medicare, and other changes to laws that guarantee their freedom. And they've done it by being willing to put their bodies on the line again and again. And that's where all of us come in. I've talked before about intersectionality, the importance of realizing that our causes are connected, and that we can build each other up by working together. I've also talked about how white people like me need to use their privilege when we can to support causes such as Black Lives Matter. But privilege is not just about the color of your skin. Privilege is a spectrum that includes everything from place of birth to, yes, physical capabilities. Able-bodied privilege is all too often overlooked on the left. Even many marches and protests only consider accessibility as an afterthought, if at all. We have to do better. And we need to recognize that elevating disability rights helps all of us, even if we are healthy and able-bodied now. We are all going to get old or sick someday, and do you really want to spend your last moments in a prison-like nursing home? Or would you rather spend them at home? Remember, though, if you do join this cause, to center the work of the sick and disabled and let them lead. They're experienced, and it's their fight, first and foremost. One of the mottos of the disability rights struggle is "nothing about us without us." Oh, and incidentally, this segment's primary author, Kit O'Connell, is a disabled journalist. The work that the healthcare protesters are doing is for all of us, and they can't win this fight alone, just like Black Lives Matter can't win this fight without white people. If Trumpcare, any version passes, millions will lose what little insurance they have. Sick people will lose access to healthcare because of pre-existing conditions, and millions of disabled people could lose the services that help them live independent lives. The GOP plan includes more than $800 billion in cuts to Medicaid in the form of per capita caps, meaning the amount of money that the federal government provides to states would be capped or limited to a certain fixed amount per Medicaid recipient based on 2016 spending levels. The announced goal of this is to, save the federal government money for more important things like bombing people. But here's what that really means. As the nation's primary source of funding for the services that help people with disabilities stay in their own homes, Medicaid plays a vital role in protecting Americans with disabilities from institutionalization. And again, the Affordable Care Act is very far from the perfect solution to our healthcare problems. It's expensive, complicated, and puts too much money in the hands of corrupt insurance companies. Jessica Lehman, the executive director of Senior and Disability Action, explained the situation in her hometown of San Francisco. San Francisco seniors, people with disabilities, and our children and families are hurting under our current healthcare system. People are facing exorbitant copays and premiums, lack of access to doctors and vital services that are not covered at all, from mental health to wheelchairs to home care. The cost of living is so high in San Francisco that people are going without the health care that they desperately need. And San Francisco is not alone. As the cost of living continues to rise across the country, more and more people are finding themselves unable to partake in the supposedly affordable and supposedly caring ACA. In short, the ACA is shitty. The AHCA is fucking horrific. Indeed, the only solution that leaves no one uninsured and covers all healthcare-related costs is Medicare for all. Imagine a system that provides unconditional healthcare for everyone, from birth to death. It's not that far-fetched. Countries around the world do it and manage to somehow keep from falling into an abyss of economic disaster. I mean, it could have something to do with the fact that they're not spending 31% of their healthcare costs on trying to maintain a broken system. We pour $500 billion a year into administrative costs that are specifically designed to keep people away from the care that they need. Yes, we literally pay to keep people sick. We can and need to do a lot fucking better, and we'll dive more into this specific subject of single payer next week as we near Medicare's birthday on July 30th, but for now, here is a brief recap on the Medicare for All battle, a piece from our interview with Dr. Margaret Flowers.
The fault is our system, is the fact that we have a market-based system for healthcare in the United States where we treat healthcare as a commodity and not as a public good. And we're an outlier because of that. Most other civilized countries do not treat healthcare that way. So really in a market system, the incentive is charge as much as you can. So it's really the fact that we just don't have a system that allows there to be any kind of rational pricing. And that's part of the reason why I fight for a national improved Medicare for all. If we had a national improved Medicare for all, where everybody was in the system, one set of rules for everybody, it's comprehensive, it puts the decision-making capacity back into the hands of health professionals and patients instead of these administrators that are trying to blockade it, we could spend 10% or less on administration, and people wouldn't have copays and deductibles. They would just... You need care, you go get the care, doctor submits it to the system pays them back. It would be so much easier for patients, but it would also be so much easier for health professionals. And it's the complication that's driving primary care docs out of practice within 10 to 15 years right now.
And in that same vein, it's also, doctors are now incentivized to get people to take a bunch of medicine because they get a piece of that pie.
Another big problem in this country is the direct-to-consumer advertising. So we have pharmaceutical companies that are having ads everywhere telling people that if you don't feel perfect and the sky's not sunny all day and you're not bouncing through the flowers, that you need something. And so patients come in with a preconceived idea that they need something. Doctors don't have the time to really sit down and talk to them and run through it. Patients want something, they're not going to feel satisfied, they're not going to come back if they don't leave the office with something. But doctors also want to do something and they don't have a lot of time. So it has really created this situation where we're using way too many medications. And they actually send pharmaceutical representatives in to shadow the physicians in their offices and actually see how they interact with patients. And are they reporting back they didn't prescribe this medication? And they're getting pharmaceutical data from the pharmacist so that they can say to a physician, hey, we sent you to this conference, we paid for your nice hotel and your car, but we're looking at your prescribing rate and it's not very high. So it's really messed up for sure.
Clearly. Thinking about how much of a mess this is on both sides, big pharma and our system in terms of insurance, is single payer something that can be done in one fell swoop, or do we have to take steps? Would there be something like a legitimate Affordable Care Act that would be a step in the right direction, or is this just one?
It's one. Yeah. For decades now, because I've been looking into this, we've tried to tweak the current system, and every single time we've done it, it has failed. We continue in the same path. And so the lowest incremental step that we can take right now is to just immediately expand, a national traditional publicly financed Medicare to every single person. That gives us the ability to simplify the administration, which gives us the cost savings so that we can provide comprehensive benefits. It allows us to negotiate for fair prices for services and pharmaceuticals, and it also allows us to give hospitals operating budgets so that they're not having to micromanage everything, and they can just focus on taking care of patients that walk in the door so that there's much more clinical interaction.
To see the full interview with Margaret Flowers, check out the link below and in the video description. For more on the Medicare for All battle, visit healthoverprofit.org. And if you're sitting there healthy and able-bodied thinking that, this doesn't concern me, it does. Even if you don't know anyone, or even if you somehow miraculously go through life without ever needing health care, do you really want to contribute to a system that keeps disabled people in fucking institutions? Or dumps them like fucking trash, as was the case in 2007 in Los Angeles when several hospitals were under investigation for dumping homeless patients onto the streets. These patients, many of them not only physically but also mentally ill, were driven in ambulances contracted by the hospitals and abandoned on the streets of the neighborhood known as Skid Row, an area in downtown Los Angeles where literally thousands of homeless people crowd in order to try and take advantage of the overcrowded shelters and assistance programs. And this has continued to be a problem long after those cases were brought to light. In one such dumping case in 2014, a 38-year-old woman, homeless and battling drug addiction, was wearing a hospital gown. Her only possession was a note with an 800 number and the definition of schizophrenia. That is the kind of system that we live in. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year to make sure that that woman gets dumped on the streets of fucking Los Angeles in a hospital gown. To make sure that that person doesn't get a wheelchair because fuck them. To make sure that that kid dies of cancer because you know what? Fuck him too. Why would you want to live in that system that drags people from wheelchairs because they had the gall to say that they want autonomy over their bodies and their lives? Regardless of whether we're healthy or sick, able-bodied or disabled, we can fight. We have to fight. And we can put our bodies on the line for something better that benefits us all. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide and the YouTube description to see the sites mentioned in this week's show. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and subscribe on YouTube. Till next time, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.